Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you. And thank you for coming to Nyack campus. We welcome you. Um, I'll be doing a lecture today, and also I will post on my portal review for your upcoming midterm on November 1st. The review that I have for you for your midterm is a list of vocabulary words that we have gone over during the past few weeks. These will be very important for you to be successful on your midterm. Once again, right before the midterm, it would be good for you to review the videos that we've had for each class section so that you're familiar with the artists and the types of movement that we've had. So once again, your midterm will be November 1st, which is week 8. Now, the only difference between my class and the other 3 classes is that Nyack has assigned me virtual classes for recordings during our midterm week. You will be able to do your midterm, but if you are very busy and you don't get to review that week's class, you can do it the following week, all right? But there will be no homework. Everyone else who has a midterm, a regular midterm, will post their midterm and not have a lecture. Only this class will have both lecture and midterm. But towards the end of the second semester, you'll have a week off with my class, all right? I just had to do this to make sure that the in-person classes had a lecture, right? Please make sure that you are logging into all 4 teacher portals, right? It is very important because sometimes you do 2 and you forget another one. You must make sure that you log into each portal, and we're posting on different days. And if there's homework, complete it and then click submit. Today's visual arts class is going to examine a school of art called Ashcan art. And it did not last for that long a period of time, but it did work to try to change what artists viewed as artwork. Now, remember, in some of the weeks that we have had prior, we have looked at very finely painted art. And then we got into the Impressionists, who were still painting fine art, but using those short, choppy brush strokes. And that was already starting to get away from the standard portrait landscape painting. Also remember that some artists during that time, using those choppy brush strokes that they didn't blend in the color, were also doing like an outline around their art to try to pull the pieces together. So as we progress in this class, we're going to see how artists begin to try to change the face of the art world. For instance, in the 18th century, you would never see sculpture made out of car parts like we saw during our sculpture class. They would say that's ridiculous, that's garbage, that's junk, okay? But as art moved along and sculpture developed and we became more abstract, that type of artwork became accepted. And this school of art, the Ashcan School, definitely worked towards starting to change the face of art and what was considered art. So let me start with that. The Ashcan School took place in the US during the late and mid 20th century. And it's known for works of paintings of daily, everyday life. The difference with the Ashcan School of Art is that it was done in poorer neighborhoods. It didn't show you the glorified rich people that so much art in the past had, but it actually started to show people like street cleaners, peasants, even prostitutes. It wanted to show neighborhoods that might be run down, or paintings of poor children with their mothers, right? So remember last week when we looked at a piece at Washington Square, we saw this beautiful piece of art, but in the front we saw the street sweeper, right? That was starting the person who was cleaning the street to show some everyday people in art. Some of the best known artists in the Ashcan School were John Sloan, George Bellows, Maurice Pendergrast, and Edward Hopper. And today we will see an overview of what the Ashcan School is like. And then we will also discuss various artists of that period and also see videos of their works. All right, the first video that I'm going to show you is called The Ashcan School. So take a look at it and then we'll talk about it. Just ignore the ads.
I'm Susan Euler. You may not have heard of the Ashcan School, but at the turn of the 20th century, they were the height of daring and avant-garde artists, at least in America. In this program, we're going to see how the Ashcan School introduced American audiences to modern European as well as American art. The name Ashcan School is a misnomer. There never was an Ashcan School in the sense of an organized art movement with shared goals and methods of working. Rather, Ashcan is a style. The Ashcan style consists of loose Impressionist brushstrokes, but without the pastel Impressionist colors. Ashcan colors are dark and somber, in keeping with the artist's favorite subject matter, the urban poor, mainly those living in and around the American cities of New York and Philadelphia at the turn of the 20th century, which is when the style developed. The Ashcan style first gained national attention in 1908, when 8 of the painters associated with it held a group show at the Macbeth Gallery, located on Fifth Avenue in New York City. They called themselves simply the 8. Only 5 of the 8 actually painted in what can be described as an Ashcan style. These artists were Robert Henry and John Sloan, George Lukes and Everett Shinn, and William Glackens. The other 3 men, Maurice Prendergast, Ernest Lawson, and Arthur B. Davies, painted in much brighter colors and did not necessarily choose subjects from the inner city. Nonetheless, they are called Ashcan artists by art historians because they were very active in the larger group and were bound together not by strict adherence to a particular style, but by friendship and a shared dedication to modern art. The 8, as well as others associated with the Ashcan style, were educated and well-trained professionals. Many had attended leading art schools, including the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia, where a number of them had met. Most had traveled extensively in Europe, especially in France, before returning to the United States to begin their careers as artists. Robert Henry, the group's driving force, studied at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, where he was a student of realist painter Thomas Anschiss, who himself had been a student of Thomas Eakins. Eakins, a professor at the Academy, had shocked the establishment in the 1880s by his then controversial teaching methods, which included using photographs as drawing aids and using live nude models instead of plaster casts in drawing classes. Most shockingly, Eakins was an outspoken advocate for admitting women to art schools where they could study alongside of men. He was eventually fired from his teaching job at the Academy in 1886 for removing a loincloth from a male model during a drawing class in which ladies were present. Thomas Eakins was a role model for the next generation of painters, men such as Everett Shinn, Robert Henry, John Sloan, and the others associated with the Ashcan style. Like Eakins, these artists also wanted to challenge the way art was taught and exhibited in America. In fact, this had been the reason behind the show at the Macbeth Gallery in 1908, which had introduced the Eight to a wider American audience. The show was very successful, and after it closed in New York, John Sloan arranged for it to tour to 7 more cities, including Chicago and Cincinnati, where it drew large and enthusiastic crowds. One Ohio newspaper ran a headline that read, "Big Sensation at Art Museum." And so it was. Ashcan art was a hit, and sales and opportunities for additional shows greatly increased. You sometimes hear that wealthy Americans hated Ashcan art and made fun of it. Not true. The artwork struck a chord with American audiences of all social classes. The subject matter and the style were exactly right for the times. However, the name Ashcan was given to the style in 1915 by a negative critic who, after seeing a drawing by George Bellows entitled "Disappointments of the Ashcan," decided that this was a good way to describe the entire style. Ah well, you can't please everyone. Incidentally, Ashcans are what we call today garbage cans. Although they certainly did paint garbage cans and the inner city poor, Ashcan artists did not portray their subjects as downtrodden or hopeless. Rather, the people living in the inner city, many of them newly arrived immigrants, are depicted as vigorous and hardworking, vital contributors to a new, modern American way of life. Their smiles and positive attitudes are infectious. This won the approval of heiress and generous art patron Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, who in 1911 sponsored a major exhibit of modern American art in the Madison Gallery in New York. The Association of American Painters and Sculptors grew out of this very successful show. Of course, all the 8 became members. One additional member that might surprise you was Gutzon Borglund, the sculptor who created the portraits on Mount Rushmore. So now let's take a look at the Armory Show, a landmark exhibit of modern art that really set a lot of Americans' teeth on edge. Arthur B. Davies, a member of the 8 who did not paint in the Ashcan style, was elected president of the newly formed Association of American Painters and Sculptors. In the summer of 1912, he received a catalog from a large and comprehensive show of modern art being held in Germany. Flush with the recent success of their own shows, Davies and another artist, Walt Kuhn, rushed to Europe and furiously set about contacting artists and galleries in order to mount an exhibition of modern art in New York similar to the one in Germany. The resulting show opened on February 17, 1913. Officially, it was called the International Exhibition of Modern Art, but it became known as the Armory Show. The Armory Show, which was held in the 69th Army Regiment building on Lexington Avenue, was greeted with much fanfare and excitement by both artists and the public. 4,000 guests attended the opening gala. In his welcoming speech, John Quinn, prominent Irish-American lawyer and art patron, exclaimed, "The members of the American Association of Painters and Sculptors have shown you that American artists, young American artists that is, do not dread and have no need to dread the ideas or the culture of Europe. They believe that in a domain of art, only the best should rule. This exhibition will be epic-making." True, but not exactly as Quinn and the other organizers had envisioned. American audiences had thought they were pretty sophisticated in their appreciation of modern art. After all, hadn't they enthusiastically accepted the Ashcan's bold depictions of immigrants and inner-city life? But this European stuff was different, particularly Cubism and Futurism. It didn't look real. It was confusing. Condemned as degenerate, insane, lurid, and not fit for American eyes, The Armory show made headlines day after day. The most talked about work was Nude Descending a Staircase by Marcel Duchamp, called Rude Descending a Staircase, Explosion in the Shingle Factory, and Rush Hour in the Subway, among other things. This work came to stand for everything that was bad and shocking about modern art. And American artists such as Arthur B. Davies, who defended it and began including Cubist elements in their own paintings, found themselves condemned as un-American, seduced away from good American values by the decadence of Europe. A line had been drawn. On one side were the people who believed that real American art was realistic and, like the Ashcan style, depicted things that could be easily recognized and understood. In the 1920s and 30s, this style became known as American scene painting. On the other side were the modernists. These artists adapted the abstract styles of Europe, but used them, or so they argued, in a uniquely American way. The debate over what was American art and what was just modernist dirt, to quote Thomas Hart Benton, raged on until well into the 1950s. And echoes of that debate, one that began over 100 years ago at the Armory Show, can still be heard today. For the 10-Minute Professor, this is Susan Ray Euler. Thanks for tuning in, and make sure.
Okay, so as you see, everything that we want or people want to do to increase change is always met with opposition. Let's recoup what we just heard in this. There was never really a school called the Ashcan School. It was more of a movement. Now, they called it that because they thought it looked like garbage, and the word Ashcan meant garbage can. Not everyone liked it, but many did, right? The difference was, again, that they were painting scenes of everyday life in areas of that were depressed and not affluent, and that the colors were dark and not bright. But they did carry on with some of the ideas of what Impressionists used. These were all very professionally trained artists that were painting, and some of the changes that they made were to include live models. You have to realize that when artists before this time were painting a nude figure, a human figure, they used plaster casts. Now, when you're in art school, they always have nude models so that you can see the musculature, the bones, the way the body moves when it's in a position. And we take that for granted now. But back then, they would have these statues that they would paint from. So that was one of the things that made them sort of taboo or went against the grain. The other thing was that they wanted to challenge what was taught in art. You have to remember that women were not allowed to go to art school and learn alongside men. It's just the way it was. If you remember in last week's lesson, we talked about Marie Cassatt, and she was an Impressionist, and she realized very quickly that if she did not have a friend on the jury, the group that decided who was going to display their work and who would win, her artwork would not get into a show. But she was a very strong woman, and she refused to have to be friends or kind or accompany a man to get her work in. And it wasn't until she befriended Degas did her work start to be shown. So now these Ashcan artists are actually breaking that line and saying, look, you don't have to be friendly or a pal of these jury members to get your work in. You can get your work in on its merit, on whether it's good or not, whether it's painted by a man or a woman. So this is another very, very revolutionary idea for the time. One of the painters that I'd like to discuss is John Sloan, and he was originally an illustrator and a realist painter. And he was part of the Ashcan movement, and he painted scenes from everyday life. He would go out and paint these everyday life scenes, and he would paint not only in New York City, but in Philadelphia and in Gloucester, Massachusetts. And at first he painted in a limited way, but then he started to add a little bit more color to his work, and that made his work stand out. So let's take a look at what we're going to do right now. We're going to take a look at his work and see what that looks like, okay? Let's see if I can do this for you. I'm just going to get this to work for us. No, this is not what I want. Hold on. Just give me a second, okay? All right, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this, and I'll get your video up about John Sloan in a minute, all right? Let's see if I can get it up this way. Okay, good. I'm stopping it because for some reason I cannot get this to share the screen. Let me see if I can get it now. Okay. I think you're going to get it.
7 out of 10 deaths in the US are caused by chronic illnesses that are preventable, like heart disease, cancer.
Okay, I'm just going to stop this and see if I can get somebody to help me with this for a second, but I will go on. The next artist that I want to talk to you about is John Bellows, and he was an American realist painter, was known for his painting of urban life as well. Urban life, life in the city, the same sort of thing that all Ashcan artists had done. And he was one of the greatest artists of the time, and he was very powerful with his art. It was strong. It depicted scenes of boxing matches. You saw some of those earlier. And you also saw gritty scenes from New York City. tenement houses, people who were poor, that sort of thing. So these artists are bringing into light the less charmed life, that we had seen so much before in the Impressionist stage. And to make it seem a little darker, we would also see the dark colors that were used and the way the brush strokes were bringing things in. And as I said, most artists were doing New York City, but others were doing life in Philadelphia and also in Massachusetts. Their main goal, their main format for everything was to reverse the previous thought of what people viewed art as. Okay, and in that first video that we saw people looking at ashcan art and then comparing it to when artists were coming in like Picasso in the really abstract art, and they were having a real hard time with that because that's something different. It's just like life today. When computers first started coming in, for instance, people who had never seen a computer thought that it would steal your ideas, that all the information that was available would be gone. Well, these artists were doing things controversially, and the statement that this was not for eyes of Americans definitely meant something else. All right, it definitely meant that we were not supposed to show that sort of thing in the United States, right? So that's why people thought, this is kind of sketchy art. But these canvases and paintings showed movement and liveliness. You could see the people hanging the clothes on the clotheslines. You could see the vendors in the streets hawking their wares, trying to sell apples and pears to people. These artists worked very, very hard to get this new art form out. And they were focusing on people walking in parks, as I said, and they rejected that finished, polished look of the artworks that started before them, okay? And they wanted to show a simple personal vision of art that was in these settings. It was, you got to remember, they didn't have a lot of photographs that went out all over the place. And in newspapers, many of the pictures were done with engravings. It's not like what we have today. I mean, there weren't things like TVs and computers to show what life was like. So they felt that their art was showing another dimension of America. So their art was sketchy, short lines, short strokes. It was done very fast. It was painted very quickly. Okay, and that's because these artists were used to working for newspapers. So they would see what they had to do, sketch it quickly, capture a pose, and move on. Okay, and they translated that into the art that they were now producing. Again, quick brush strokes, quick sketches. Many times art was finished in a week as opposed to several months. That made things much different. They were looking at capturing new forms of realism. And they were looking at trying to show a commercial side of art and also social expectations, all right? And they talked about in our first video, Robert Henry. Now, he came from a family, his father was sort of a criminal. He studied art and he wanted to, also, he was a group leader for the Ashcan art section. So what happens here is that he changes his name to Robert Henry instead of Henry because he doesn't want to be known as the son of a man who's been arrested and is a criminal. All right. And he's the group leader and he looks to challenge everything about art. And he says, we should create art for art's sake, not we should create art for art's sake, meaning art should be a picture into the world that we are, a window into our lives, whether rich, poor, happy, or sad. Okay, so he's known for that line, art for art's sake. What united these artists was their drive and their opposition towards the world in front of them. And Henri wanted to have galleries with open art exhibitions with no prizes, okay? No prizes at all. And one of the things that they did in one of the shows that we saw in the first video was they hung the paintings alphabetically. And why did they do that? Because in the past, more well-known artists and more artists that were prominent always had their artwork placed in the area where you could see it better. It was in the beginning of the gallery. It was at a height where you could see it with your eyes instead of looking up and worse, looking down. It was hung alphabetically to give every artist the same opportunity. If your name started with an A, you were in the beginning, okay? There was no pressure from the jury. Yes, there was no jury. All right, and we saw that that independent arts exhibition of 1910 was an attempt to put the presentation of artists and put artists in power, not a jury in power. No jury, no prize, okay? So what does that mean? It means it's a slap in the face to traditional art exhibitions and those who felt that they were very important in that. They said, your ways are wrong. It's time to change that. So that with the inclusion of women into the art classes and then depicting urban scenes or things that are aggravating, making the public angry with the Ashcan group. And as you heard that this exhibition, there were 500 works and over 2,000 people attended. And it lasted for about 3 to 4 weeks. And this was a very big idea. And what happens is they think that they're going to sell most of their work out because it's a rage in the paper. Huge artwork, great, great exhibition, something different. Well, people do come for that. They do come for the artwork, but very few pieces are sold. Again, what does this mean? What does it show? It shows, right? It shows that it is hard to introduce new artwork or a new movement or a new way of thinking. People came to look and see. People did not come to buy. All right. So this artwork was creating a lot of enthusiasm and talk, but it was going to take a while for it to catch on. And that was really important. Just give me 1 second and I'll try to pull up a video.